Our final speaker before lunch is a Christchurch local and has been the Member of Parliament for Wigram since 2011. She is the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Infrastructure, the Minister for Energy and Resources, the Minister for Building and Construction, as well as the Associate Minister for Finance. She also has the job as Campaign Director for the October 14 election. She is, in short, someone who is rather pukumahi at the moment. She is busy. Please welcome the Honourable Megan Woods.
Thanks, Jack. Tēnā koutou ina matawaka. Kia koutou nai tuaherere, tēnā koutou. Nā mate huhuia o te wā, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Hoki mai kia tātou te konahi ora iti nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou e ranga i te kaupapa o te rā. Noi reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you here today at the Build Nations. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Margaret Devlin, Chair of Infrastructure New Zealand, the INZ Board, Chief Executive Nick Leggett, and the team for hosting this event. But especially I'd like to congratulate you for your foresight in hosting this wonderful event in Christchurch. Welcome to Otatahi, everybody. For too long, governments have kicked the can down the road when it comes to investing in resilient and essential infrastructure. It is imperative that we embark on the long-term nation building that I believe a responsible government simply must do. And this is a perfect fit for your conference theme, From Ambition to Action. In Budget 23, our Hipkins Labour government did just that, looking ahead but with maintaining a focus on doing the basics well. We all agree New Zealand has a significant infrastructure deficit. Treasury last year estimated the cost of addressing the current deficit and stopping it getting worse at $210 billion over the next 30 years. In order to address this, we need strategic, long-term and integrated approaches, and yes, I agree, depoliticised approaches. And this is why we established Te Wahanga, the Infrastructure Commission, an autonomous Crown entity to focus on that long-term strategic vision. In a time of global economic downturn, high inflation here and around the world, earlier than expected climate change tests from weather events in New Zealand, and a geopolitical situation dominated by war, trade disputes and ongoing supply chain issues, we have a lot to deal with. There are big challenges as this government continues to use a well-being approach to ensure we look after people now while we also build that strong foundation for our future generations. And that's why over the last 5 years we have invested $45 billion in infrastructure projects. And in Budget 2023, we have committed a further $71 billion over the next 5 years to help fix the infrastructure deficit. But importantly, alongside this investment, we have adopted a strategic approach, an action plan, and a prioritisation system. This will ensure that we can turn ambition into reality. Budget 2023 acknowledges where we are at today and the issues that we need to address right now, alongside the country's future needs. For this reason, the investment package for Budget 2023 focused on the following 4 priorities: supporting New Zealanders with the current cost of living, delivering the services that New Zealanders rely on, recovery and resilience, and fiscal sustainability. Our investments in the infrastructure system supports the 4 budget priorities and allows us to deliver on the government response to Rautaki Hānana o Aotearoa, the New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy. Alongside Budget 2023, we published the Infrastructure Action Plan, which builds on the government response to the infrastructure strategy, being smarter about the way we plan, deliver and use infrastructure is critical if we are to close the infrastructure deficit and deliver the infrastructure New Zealanders need now and into our futures. This means careful new investment in new assets alongside extensive use of non-built solutions. The Infrastructure Action Plan supports this by identifying actions across the wider work programme that will start to address challenges that will allow us to deliver the system-level transformation required to get more out of our infrastructure. The Infrastructure Action Plan outlines the following focus areas where the government will continue to make improvements over the coming years. Ensuring that our infrastructure rebuild and new build is resilient in the face of climate change, natural disasters and increasing extreme weather events. Strengthening infrastructure investment decision-making and governance, strengthening partnerships with and opportunities for Māori, local government and the private sector, and building the capacity and capability of the government and of the infrastructure workforce to deliver and to maintain infrastructure, so that you can see that the plan takes a broader view than just investment. Obviously, investment is absolutely critical, but it also introduced that range of system, governance and policy changes that are critical if we are to finally address this infrastructure deficit. The Infrastructure Action Plan confirms this government's ongoing commitment to addressing the challenges that we have. I'm proud to be part of a government that places infrastructure front and centre and how that supports our goal to build a high-wage, low-emissions economy that provides economic security in good times and bad. The ability of infrastructure systems to function during adverse conditions and quickly recover is fundamental to the well-being of communities. The Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle have demonstrated the importance of ensuring that we build infrastructure that is resilient. For these reasons, a solid starting point is the setting aside of $6 billion in Budget 23 as part of the new National Resilience Plan, and the plan will ensure we build back better from recent weather events with greater resilience to protect New Zealanders from increasingly severe and unpredictable weather events. We will future-proof our road, rail and local infrastructure that was damaged, as well as our telecommunications and electricity transmission infrastructure. A central theme of our new National Resilience Plan is to build back better and to address that deficit at the same time. Long-term planning and a clear pipeline of work will provide confidence and certainty to you, the infrastructure sector. The Construction Sector Accord is another exemplar of transformative action, where government and industry work together towards a thriving, fair and sustainable construction setting with the common goal of a better Aotearoa New Zealand. In the Accord's first work programme, it mobilised quickly to connect government and industry to address the impacts from COVID-19, developed the Construction Skills and Diversity Roadmap and partnered with Te Wahanga and Standards New Zealand to begin the review of NZS 3910, the construction sector's most commonly used contract. The Accord is now a year into its second work programme, with several initiatives such as building leaders advisory services to support leaders of SMEs to increase resilience, adopt new technology and reduce emissions and waste. You may have also seen that consultation has begun on the draft NZS 3910 conditions of contract. This milestone has come after 14 months of intense discussions and debates that the Accord has helped lead, and I encourage you to have your say on the draft through the Standards New Zealand website. Budget 23 is also about investing in the plan ahead, and I'm pleased to talk to you today about something that is still in the early stages of development but will have an impact on the infrastructure system. This is the infrastructure priority list that Te Wahanga and Treasury are developing. The list has the potential to be a game changer, standardising the process to assess infrastructure proposals, ensuring value for money, and building an enduring project consensus from a very early stage. In simple terms, the infrastructure priority list purpose is to assess projects during the planning phase to determine which investments are a priority for New Zealand. It will also provide a standardised and rigorous approach to assessing projects, long-term strategic alignment and value, and it will provide early visibility of problems, which will provide better solutions and enable and encourage agencies to work together and, importantly, for the market to prepare for the future pipeline of work. It also provides confidence across the sector to better plan and invest in building and training our workforce, as well as devoting the resources needed for new technologies and equipment. As you are aware, Otakaro Limited, the Christchurch Rebuild Agency, has been repurposed to help government organisations deliver infrastructure projects. Minister Robertson announced this last year at this conference, and already it is a reality, up and running. Otakaro Limited, now known as Raupainga, a Central Crown infrastructure delivery agency. Raupainga is a national infrastructure delivery agency whose role is to support organisations that don't have the day-to-day experience of delivering large, complex projects to get projects done efficiently and effectively. And the role they are taking in the new archives building is a good example of how this agency can work with an organisation, Archives New Zealand, who are not going to have a long and sustained building program. We've allocated $100 million in Budget 23, funding over a 5-year period for Raupainga to undertake its initial portfolio of projects. This will help us deliver on our large work program as we capitalise on the robust processes and experiences in project delivery that Raupainga bring. Beyond its project portfolio, I have asked Raupainga to focus on helping the Crown to be a better customer, building delivery capability within the Crown and supporting the growth of a robust domestic construction sector. We can be better at building enduring relationships across ongoing pipelines of projects, and we will be. We must be. As the Minister responsible for the Christchurch Rebuild in the latter years, I have seen firsthand how this organisation experienced in the end-to-end planning and delivery of major projects operated. Today, in fact, we are attending a conference within a building that illustrates the success of that organisation and is an example of the type of infrastructure that Raupainga will help us to deliver. As we work to tackle the challenges of climate change and natural hazards, we also need to consider the opportunities that building resilience presents us. I acknowledge that there is an investment challenge for electricity generation and networks to enable the electrification of transport and heat, and that the scale and pace of investment required to meet these targets is fierce. But we have set several targets relating to energy to support our growing economy, meet our climate goals, and balance that all-important energy trilemma. These targets relate to emissions in energy and include a target for net zero emissions of long-lived greenhouse gases by 2050 and 3 emissions budgets, a target for 50% of total final energy consumption to come from renewable sources by 2035, and an aspirational target for 100% renewable electricity by 2030. These targets will only be achieved by a united effort across the energy sector. Government, industry, consumers and communities all need to focus on improving productivity, increasing choices and lowering costs. As we decarbonise our energy sector through electrification, we will require significant growth in electricity generation investments investment, with estimates varying between doubling and tripling our current generation over the coming decades. That's why we are moving swiftly on new opportunities, such as offshore wind. We have worked with the sector to get a regulatory regime up and running that will allow for the international investment that wants to land on this opportunity in New Zealand. We are also seeing innovative funding and financing opportunities present itself, with our own super fund wanting to partner with Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners on the development of offshore wind, amongst many other opportunities that are out there. Because we need significant growth in generation, but we also need significant growth in transmission and distribution infrastructure as we decarbonise. And as we do that, energy efficiency has been the most significant source of emissions reductions that we have seen this century. As an example, more than 100,000 homes through Budget 2023 will be retrofitted with insulation and efficient heating, saving families 16% of their energy bills in winter. A win for the consumers, but also a win for the grid and for infrastructure not being under strain at peak times. Another significant challenge in growing our electricity investment is that much of the growth will be intermittent or weather-dependent wind and solar. This brings big challenges when our weather is not compliant and there is a lack of water in our hydro dams. The New Zealand Battery Project is investigating options to address New Zealand's dry year risk, including the use of pumped hydro storage to manage peak demand, dry hydrological years, and the variability of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. As well as the option for pumped hydro, we're also looking at a portfolio approach of biomass, hydrogen, and flexible geothermal. A detailed business case for this project is expected to be completed by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment by early 2024. While government has begun to set the course, there is much to be done by all infrastructure asset owners, including central government, local government, and the private sector. Thank you for the work that you are doing to make this happen. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I wish you a successful conference that inspires and encourages you to continue your important work. Ngā mihi nui.
Yeah, take a seat. A few curly questions from the floor you'll be pleased to hear.
Excellent.
Great. Minister, there didn't appear to be a whole lot of action in the action plan. What will you do to speed up infrastructure delivery and deliver on the strategy?
Yeah, so the Infrastructure Action Plan is a really critical part, and there's about 300 old actions in there. Some of them are quite top level, and that's where I think that what I spoke about today is also really important, which is that infrastructure priority list, so that we go from the strategy to the action list to then the priority list of what those infrastructure projects will be, that we can start to assess across everywhere what are the strategic priorities for New Zealand. We know that we can only deliver so much infrastructure at once, so what is it that we're going to prioritise? What's the batting order for that infrastructure?
It sounds pretty similar to National's policy that they were announcing this morning. That comes through Infracom. They have a 30-year pipeline, decide on projects. Why can't we get to a point where we can reach some sort of political agreement about this structure?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I haven't had a chance to have a detailed look at what National's put out. I was flying home and on the plane this morning. But one of the things that we did when we got into government was set up Te Wahanga, the Infrastructure Commission, an autonomous Crown entity, so that you could take it back, that step, that you can have this longer term view that hopefully will go across governments, because I think it is in everyone's best interest. So in terms of those 30-year plans, we've got them. That's the kind of planning we're doing. What we have to have is governments committing to putting in their share of the funding. I think what we've shown in our 6 years of government, that we've invested in infrastructure like we haven't seen in generations. So I agree. My hope is that through instruments like the Infrastructure Commission, that we can take some of the back and forward politicisation of deciding what infrastructure projects get funded. I think that shouldn't be something that is used as a political football. I think that we do have to have that strategic and long-term vision for New Zealand about what is in the nation's best interest.
So what more can you do to suck the politics out of it?
Well, I think that infrastructure priority list is a really, really critical tool. That's where you have a standardised process for assessing which projects are most important, not where there happens to be a by-election at the time and someone might make some promises, that you're actually assessing what is in the nation's best interests in terms of what we know we all have to do to solve this infrastructure deficit.
Have you sought bipartisan support for the Infrastructure Action Plan?
In terms of discussing that, I mean, absolutely open to it. I haven't explicitly had a discussion. It's absolutely something that I'm open to. I think the way in which we've removed that back from it being the government of the day's strategy, it's that autonomous crowned entity, obviously a part of the broader family of government, but it is that one step removed. It's flowed from that, and I think that's the kind of tools that we need in New Zealand, so that someone doesn't feel the need, if there is a change of government, to come in and rip up plans simply because they've got a different logo on them.
But also to guarantee the funding, which is the critical part.
Absolutely, and the funding is absolutely critical. I mean, everybody in this room knows you can have the best strategies, you can have the best action plans, you can have the best priority lists, but if there isn't funding there to do it, then you're never going to make any gains.
Speaking of, how do we improve the use of alternative tools like infrastructure funding and financing tools and value capture?
So value capture is a policy that we're doing quite a lot of work on in terms of how it is, what that would look like in a New Zealand context. How is it that we make sure that the people that are benefiting the most from what all taxpayers are investing in infrastructure, how it is that the taxpayers are getting their return on those. So we've been doing some detailed work within some of the work, particularly in some of the Auckland projects around that. In terms of the alternative tools like the infrastructure funding and financing tools that we've already seen one go through, we've got others that are in the pipeline at the moment. This is a new tool for New Zealand. It's a really important tool. But what we have to do is make sure that we're using it in the right place. Sometimes, actually direct Crown investment is the much better tool. So a good example of that was, I think, that when we as a government were first developing the infrastructure funding and financing tool, that we thought some of the upgrade to infrastructure to have more housing in Porirua, the IFF could be a good tool there. What we quickly realised is that actually if we were to use that tool there, we would price people that currently live in Porirua probably out of being able to live in their own community. And that's where, through the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, we've made that direct investment, which is the first time the Crown has done these kind of direct investments since the 1970s. So that's one of the large-scale projects that's been funded.
But is there an ideological factor in all of this? Like, well, what do you say to people who think that Labour and Labour governments are too opposed to private capital?
Oh, look, I think that they just need to look at our record and the way in which we're doing this. We're the party that put in place the infrastructure funding and financing tool. We've also seen, before we even passed that legislation, we saw the Milldale project go ahead with a range of developments that need to happen there. Innovative solutions like ACC being one of the funds that came in and invested. I talked about offshore wind, that what I'm really pleased to see that while there is a lot of international capital interested in those opportunities, our own super fund is lining up besides private capital for how it can develop. So what I say is look at our record. I think that that's a dichotomy that isn't true. That we're putting in place a range of innovative measures.
Would you be open to much greater international capital?
In terms of offshore wind, a lot of the
Copenhagen,
a lot of the interest we're seeing. There is some New Zealand interest, but we're certainly seeing a lot of international capital interested in that, and it's through working with those people that are interested in that investment. We are under no illusions. The investment that is required around some of this is going to require international capital, and we're not only open to it, we're actively putting in place the regimes to attract it.
And outside of wind? for other projects?
Where it's appropriate, yes.
Where is it appropriate?
Well, I mean, there's a range of things. Like, I mean, there's some things that we want to ensure that we keep in New Zealand ownership, and I think everyone can see that. But I think that when it comes to electricity generation, that's absolutely something that we see a range, not just the offshore wind. We're actually seeing a range of quite large-scale solar arrays being built. We're seeing the rise and development in New Zealand before our eyes of independent generation. We've had independent retailers in the market for a long time, but we're really seeing independent generators come in, and some of that is international capital as well.
I appreciate you haven't had much time to go through the details. What do you make of National's 5-point plan?
It's not what's in my hand.
No.
You're gesturing there. Look, I've just seen some headlines around it. To be honest, I think what it's saying is that we need a strategic and integrated approach to infrastructure, and that's exactly what we've been working to put in place over the last 5 years. That what we're seeing is that we need to make sure that we've got good capacity and capability within our public sector. We're not always the best customers, and I think this is something we recognised really early on in terms of making sure that we were putting in place some things to actually upskill our own agencies, and the role of Raupainga will actually be working with some of those agencies that are going to do one-off projects, and I think Archives New Zealand is a really good example. In terms of developing that in-house capability for one project, it's much better to have that centralised force that can go in and help. But then on the flip side, there's some Crown agencies that have developed really good processes for delivering their infrastructure spend. I look at education, that actually they've developed good in-house capability. They've got a long-term pipeline of work that will be rolled out. I think there's probably more we could do around reducing cost of some of our schools rolled out. So I think that we recognise that we haven't always been the best infrastructure partner and customer.
A question here from the floor. Can the Minister please provide detail of the projects included within the $71 billion investment in infrastructure over the next 5 years announced as part of Budget 23?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I'm not going to give you a shopping list of $71 billion, but that's across all of the things that we need to invest in. So I often say when it comes to housing infrastructure, for example, that it's a fancy word for roads and pipes. So there's our roading projects, there's the housing spend, but one of the things in terms of the other bit that sat alongside that in the budget was the $6 billion fund that Minister Robertson announced. And we're talking about infrastructure, I think, in a slightly different way in there. There's a recognition that we need to think about our telecommunications and our electricity infrastructure within there as well. That I think that what the weather events of earlier this year demonstrated really clearly to New Zealanders, that this is critical infrastructure that we've got to make sure is resilient in the context.
The priority list is set to take 3 years. Is that too long?
What we will see is that we've got to make sure that this is a robust process. What we don't want to see is that this is constantly relitigated. Of course I want it to go faster than 3 years. I think anyone would want that to go faster than 3 years. So if there is a way of speeding it up, absolutely open to that. But what I don't want is a constantly changing priority list because we haven't got the processes for assessing it right. I think that's absolutely critical. Of course, it's got to be nimble and it's got to be responsive, and you know, no one's going to get out a tablet and a chisel and write it. That there will have to be the ability to be flexible in it. But look, if there's any opportunities to go faster with that, I think what we've shown in our first 6 years in government is that we've put in place all the building blocks to get us here. If we can hit the accelerator a bit faster on that, of course we will.
Why are so many outputs of the Infrastructure Action Plan focused on growing the public service?
I don't know that that is actually the case. One of the things that the infrastructure plan, the action plan does is actually about how we be a better customer. I think it's been that recognition that we have not always been the easiest person to grow with, to contract with. So I don't know that it's about growing the public service. What it's saying is that actually a big part of the infrastructure plan is actually that we've got to fund infrastructure, and central government is a critical part of that, that we are a customer, that we make no apologies for saying that we are putting that funding into housing, we are putting that money into roading, we are putting that money into energy, all of those things that we have to make sure that we are doing.
I will ask you a question with your Minister of Energy, Portai on. How will you speed up the consenting of private energy generation such as solar and wind?
So this is something that we've been working through really closely with the RM reform. Obviously, that we've seen a large number, particularly of solar projects that have gone through the COVID fast track process, that they've worked their way through that. And of course, that process largely gets tipped into the RM. And I've sat as a minister involved in the discussions in resource management reform, not only as the Minister of Housing, but also as the Minister of Energy. So how it is that we ensure that we can have that smooth rollout. I am probably more aware than most people about the need to double and possibly triple our generation, but it's not just our generation, it's also our transmission and distribution. It's one thing to generate it, but we've got to get it to where we need it. So that's been a critical focus for us and very much part of the conversation about RM reform.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your time with us. I know that it's a busy week for you. A good week to be Minister Woods as opposed to Minister Wood, I would think.
Always a good week to be Minister Woods.
But thank you very much for your time. Please join me in thanking the Minister for Infrastructure, Megan Woods.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart. Cheers.